In this lesson, we're going to look at what's going to be a familiar event in American history, but from the perspective of African Americans, and that's going to be the American Revolution. So, this chapter will be about African Americans and the struggle for American independence. Our lesson objectives will be to analyze the factors involved in the crisis of the British Empire, to describe what the Declaration of Independence meant to African Americans, describe the African Americans who contributed to the Enlightenment, evaluate the African American role in the War for Independence, and explain how the American Revolution weakened slavery. To start all this off, we're going to take a topic that you usually spend weeks on in your history class, and we're going to cut it down to just a few minutes just to give you an idea of what's going on. So, we're looking at the crisis that's going to lead to American independence. And a lot of it's going to start in 1757, which is going to be the beginning of the 7 Years' War. This is a war between France and the British that happened mostly in colonial America. When this war is over, there's going to be a lot of war debt. And British officials decided that Americans should pay for that war debt through taxes to kind of, because it protected their homeland and and they wanted to, share the cost of war and regulate trade and commerce. So they start passing these taxes. The problem is they're passing these taxes without any colonist having any say in it. So the group that makes the laws in the British Empire is Parliament. And Parliament has representatives from different parts of England, but not representatives from their colonies. So there was not an American in Parliament to give their say about whether or not they should pass these laws. So the colonists were not happy because many of these acts were passed without any of their input. For example, the Proclamation of 1763, this put a line along the Appalachian Mountains to prevent colonists from settling west of the Appalachians. Some of it was for, they said, to protect the colonists from Native Americans, but also to kind of cut down on the amount of troops that were needed on the frontier for protection. Also, you're going to have different things like the Sugar Act, which is going to pass a tax on sugar. The Stamp Act is going to be passed to put a tax on paper goods. So you have to remember at this time, pretty much everything needed paper. You had contracts, you had different books or pamphlets, a deck of playing cards. They would have this stamp on it that was an extra tax. Another act that was passed that colonists didn't like was the Quartering Act, and this was an act that required colonists to house and supply British soldiers. So a British soldier comes up to your house, knocks on your door, says he needs a place to stay. He takes your bed, he sleeps there, eats your food, and you have to allow that. And then later on, there's going to be other things that happen that cause dissent amongst the colonists towards the British, and different ones that you've probably heard in your history class. You have the Boston Massacre in 1770. So this image right here is a depiction of the Boston Massacre. And if you've paid attention when you learned about this in class, you'll know that this is not an accurate depiction from Paul Revere. This was one where colonists got mad at British, mainly because the British soldiers on their off time, they were taking jobs in Boston away from the colonists and for cheaper pay. And so this led to an argument, which led to taunting the soldiers, which led to throwing rocks at the soldiers, which led to what most people believe to be an accidental firing into the crowd, and it killed 5 people. Another act of dissent is the Boston Tea Party. This is when colonists are going to, as an act of protest, sneak on board British ships that were holding tea, and they're going to throw the tea into the harbor, causing a great loss of money. We're also going to see the first group come together to make decisions about whether or not to declare independence, whether or not to put together a continental army that's going to be in the Continental Congress. And then our first act act that's going to really be what starts the Revolutionary War will be Lexington and Concord, which happens in April of 1775. And that's going to be, those two skirmishes together are going to be the start of the actual Revolutionary War. All right, so let's see what the lay of the land was from before and after the French and Indian War. That's going to kind of be what starts the discontent of the Americans. So before the French and Indian War, you had the French owned a huge portion of North America. Most of the British colonies are what we consider the traditional 13 colonies. They own a little bit over by Hudson Bay, but most of it they're going to focus on the 13 colonies. You'll notice that the Spanish have a huge swath as well, and they actually end up being allies with the French, which ends up being an issue after the treaty that ends the French and Indian War. After this war is over, pretty much France, if you've noticed, all that green, we're down to the current day country of Haiti is all that's left for the French in the Western Hemisphere at this time. So you'll notice that the British end up taking over the rest of New France, and they leave, and as well as Spanish Florida, and then they leave parts of New Spain over towards modern day Texas and the western part of the United States, Mexico. So British end up taking a huge swath of land after the French and Indian War, and like I said, that proclamation line is right here where the mountains are, and colonists were really hoping that they would get to move into some of this frontier. And that was one of the things that was shot down in these acts that came prior to the American Revolution. An individual that you've hopefully studied in previous history classes that's a major part or a significant part of the American Revolution is going to be Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was the first colonist killed in the fight for independence, and he was killed at the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks had an African American father and a Native American mother. He was a fugitive slave for 20 years, and during those 20 years, he worked as a sailor, as many African Americans did at this time. He's going to be a sailor out of Boston. And so he is going to be present at the Boston Massacre. At the Boston Massacre, there's different eyewitnesses accounts of what happened. Attucks probably took the lead in confronting the captain and the 9 soldiers. And there is a witness that maintained that Attucks hit a soldier, which led to the troops firing on the mob. Later on, whenever the soldiers of the Boston Massacre were put on trial, part of the account that was given of Attucks hitting a soldier was credited in the court, and it was determined that he was most likely the first that died when the soldiers shot into the crowd. Samuel Adams, a famous patriot of the time, he's going to declare that Attucks was the first martyr to British oppression. After he dies, they carry his coffin along with the other 4 men who were killed in Boston Massacre through the town. Attucks laid in state for 3 days, and at where he was laying in state, they had 10,000 mourners that came through. And today, the grave site of the victims of the Boston Massacre are all buried together in a cemetery in Boston. So Crispus Attucks, being the first to die for the cause of the American Revolution, was African American. Another important component that we've all studied for the American Revolution will be the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is going to mean something different for African Americans as it will to white colonists. Probably the most famous quote that is often disputed over time is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So this gave a great source of optimism to African Americans because they saw that the expectation was that they're saying that everybody was equal, perhaps including African Americans and white people. This does end up getting disputed later by founding fathers, where, in a nutshell, pretty much saying that when they said all men are created equal, they didn't mean they meant all white men. Also, that was things that could have showed up in the Declaration of Independence but were deleted. Was one of the grievances had to do with slavery, and it denounced the Atlantic slave trade as a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights to life and liberty in the persons of distant African people. This was deleted mainly because South Carolina and Georgia objected to it and said they would not be a part of the Declaration of Independence if this phrase was not omitted. So this led to kind of a conflict for many Americans. They had to choose between accepting the literal meaning of the Declaration, which meant changing American society and way of life, or rejecting the ideology that supported those claims for independence. So, do we claim that all men are created equal? Or do we go back on our claims that are giving us our support for independence? One of the big impacts during this time is going to be an intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. And one of the big thinkers of this Enlightenment is going to be John Locke, who is in our picture here. And John Locke writes, he writes pamphlets, he writes other published works that are going to encourage and influence revolutionary ideas in the United States. He believed that society ran based on natural laws, and that we are born with certain rights that everybody is entitled to. He believes that humans created governments to protect those rights that we're all entitled to, and those natural rights include life, liberty, and private property. So we will see Patriot leaders charging the British government and saying that they sought to enslave Americans by depriving them of their rights. Yet you have American colonists who own slaves and are depriving those slaves of those same rights that they are claiming the British took away from them. So there's going to be, again, this conflict between what we're saying and what we're doing. By this time, you're going to have African Americans that have been in the country for quite a while, and they would have absorbed much of English culture at this time, and they would have even participated in the cries for independence. There was this hope that Patriot leaders would realize that their revolutionary principles and ideals did not go well, and they were incompatible with slavery. So during this time, you're going to have a lot of slaves that are going to make their case for freedom in the New England area. Before the Revolution, it's going to be looking at the details of contracts and technicalities, things like that. After the Revolution, you're going to have more cases based on just those ideals of universal liberty, such as the ones that John Locke proclaimed in his works. During the Enlightenment, we're also going to see African Americans that contribute to this time period. One of note is going to be Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley came to Boston from Africa on a slave ship. She did not know any English, and she learned to read and write English and studied Latin, and was the slave of a wealthy white merchant. He bought her to be a servant for his wife. She would write poems to celebrate important events, and they also reflected the values of the Enlightenment. In 1773, the Wheatleys will send her to London, where her first book of poems, which are the first book ever by an African American woman to be published, and the second by any American woman. Whenever Phillis returns to Boston, the Wheatleys are going to free her, but she does live in their house until they both had died. After she is freed, she becomes married. She has children, but they died in infancy, and she also ends up dying while giving birth to her third child, who also did not survive. Another major contributor to the Enlightenment is going to be Benjamin Banneker. And Benjamin Banneker was born free in Maryland. He's going to study many languages, science, math, astronomy. He's going to become a member of the Survey Commission in D.C. He'll be the first African American civilian employee of the U.S. government. He also published almanacs predicting positions of the sun, moon, and constellations. Probably the best summary to see of him is through this video.
Sometime in the early 1750s, a 22-year-old man named Benjamin Banneker sat industriously carving cogs and gears out of wood. He pieced the parts together to create the complex inner working of a striking clock that would, hopefully, chime every hour. All he had to help him was a pocket watch for inspiration and his own calculations. And yet, his careful engineering worked. Striking clocks had already been around for hundreds of years, but Banneker's may have been the first created in America, and it drew fascinated visitors from across the country. In a show of his brilliance, the clock continued to chime for the rest of Banneker's life. Born in 1731 to freed slaves on a farm in Baltimore, Maryland, from his earliest days, the young Banneker was obsessed with math and science, and his appetite for knowledge only grew as he taught himself astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and the study of the natural world. As an adult, he used astronomy to accurately predict lunar and solar events, like the solar eclipse of 1789, and even applied his mathematical skills to land use planning. These talents caught the eye of a local Baltimore businessman, Andrew Ellicott, who was also the Surveyor General of the United States. Recognizing Banneker's skills in 1791, Ellicott appointed him as an assistant to work on a prestigious new project, planning the layout of the nation's capital. Meanwhile, Banneker turned his brilliant mind to farming. He used his scientific expertise to pioneer new agricultural methods on his family's tobacco farm. His fascination with the natural world also led to a study on the plague life cycle of locusts. Then in 1792, Banneker began publishing almanacs. These provided detailed annual information on moon and sun cycles, weather forecasts, and planting and tidal timetables. Banneker sent a handwritten copy of his first almanac to Virginia's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. This was a decade before Jefferson became president. Banneker included a letter imploring Jefferson to embrace every opportunity to eradicate that train of absurd and false ideas and opinions that caused prejudice against Black people. Jefferson read the almanac and wrote back in praise of Banneker's work. Banneker's correspondence with the future president is now considered to be one of the first documented examples of a civil rights protest letter in America. For the rest of his life, he fought for this cause, sharing his opposition to slavery through his writing. In 1806, at the age of 75, Banneker died after a lifetime of study and activism. On the day of his funeral, his house mysteriously burned down, and the majority of his life's work, including his striking clock, was destroyed. But still, his legacy lives on.
So as you can see, Benjamin Banneker was a really fascinating character. Now we're going to look at the actual War for Independence itself and how African Americans contributed to the war effort. In the beginning, Washington and the Continental Army did not want to recruit African Americans for military service. And pretty much during the war, African Americans are going to pretty much join the side that will offer them freedom. In the South, that would mostly be fighting with the British. They were promised freedom for military service. One of the most famous British appeals for African Americans to fight came from Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of the area of Virginia. And he issued a proclamation offering to liberate slaves who would join the British Army. And we're going to see several that come to this appeal. Dunmore is initially going to recruit African American soldiers out of desperation, but then he's going to become a really big advocate of the fighting ability of African Americans. When Dunmore issued his appeal, he had only 300 British troops in his area, and this is going to expand over time. And at one point, there's going to be almost half as many African Americans that are one of the biggest advocates to plea for African Americans joining the British Army is going to be Lord Dunmore, who is a governor in the area of Virginia. He's initially going to recruit soldiers out of desperation, but he ends up actually being one of their biggest advocates for their fighting ability. This is going to really be a big psychological blow to his enemies. At one point of his 600 troops in his area, half are going to be African American, whose uniforms bore the motto "Liberty to Slaves." And this is going to be a way to encourage slaves to escape, which slave masters will blame Dunmore for this. And this is going to lead to recruiting thousands of African American men to fight in the army in exchange for their freedom. On the side of the Patriots, you're going to see quite a few African Americans that do fight in the militia, and you're gonna see more on the Patriot side towards freedom in the North than you would in the South. When the Continental Army was organized, we know that Washington forbade enlistment of African Americans, but there were African Americans, militiamen, and soldiers that did fight in the war for the Patriots. Main reason that it was forbidden was, they were afraid that it would encourage slaves to escape and leave their masters. And some white people, especially in the South, they feared arming African Americans and that it would endanger social order. Some white Americans believed that African American men would be too cowardly to be effective soldiers. And so this also got in the way of recruiting African American soldiers on the Patriot side. In the American Revolution, you're going to see African Americans fighting in almost every major battle. And as a result of their service to the Patriot cause, you're going to see more sentiments towards abolition. By the late 1770s, most Northern legislatures were already in the process of debating abolition. The reasons that we're getting to this mindset is the changes in this, especially in the North, the economic, religious, and intellectual changes are going to convince many white Americans that slavery should be abolished. We're going to see anti-slavery societies that are going to emerge, and they're going to emphasize the African American service in the war against British rule. They're going to contend that emancipation would prevent African American rebellions. As a result, by 1784, all the northern states except New Jersey and New York had either undertaken immediate emancipation or gradual abolition of slavery. More in your middle colonies, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, they're going to make manumission, which is the process of becoming freed. They're going to make it easier. South Carolina and Georgia, they're even going to work to mitigate some of the more brutal parts of slavery. And so it's starting to look more encouraging for African Americans after the war. We even see this in looking at the numbers. We see that in 1750, there weren't very many free African Americans in the North. And then by 1800, there's well over 100,000 free African Americans living in the North. Most newly freed African Americans lived in the Chesapeake area, Virginia and Maryland, mainly because it was close to family or acquaintances that were still enslaved. In the South, with Georgia and South Carolina, there's going to be a very tiny population of free African Americans. Most of your free population is going to move to cities. Women will do well in the cities. They usually found jobs as domestics or domestic servants that were paid. Some are going to face a lot of economic difficulty with freedom, trying to get back on their feet. And then also in the North and in the Chesapeake, most African Americans are going to refuse to work for their former master. They want to escape from that. They want to escape from that status of enslavement. So at the end of the American Revolution, things are progressing. Things are looking more hopeful and encouraging, as we're seeing a group of colonists who didn't want to be mistreated by the British Empire seek their independence, and this gave African Americans hope that perhaps they could eventually seek that emancipation or abolition from their current treatment in the British colonies. As we will see, that doesn't come to fruition for another 80 years or so. So our lesson objectives that we looked at are the factors involved in the crisis of the British Empire. We described what the Declaration of Independence meant to African Americans. We described the African Americans who contributed to the Enlightenment. We evaluated the African American role in the War for Independence, and we explained how the American Revolution weakened slavery.